first major seaport in the Port Phillip district was initially named Port Harwood, but was later changed to Williamstown in honour of the English monarch William IV. In 1803, Acting Lieutenant Robbins was the first European to arrive here during his exploration of the area now known as Point Gellibrand. The area north of Point Gellibrand and along the west coast of Hobson's Bay offered shelter from the prevailing westerly winds for ships offloading cargo for the new colony. The first to arrive was aboard the barque Norval in November 1835, with a consignment of 500 sheep and 50 Hereford cattle from Launceston for Dr. Alexander Thompson. Within weeks of this consignment, a stream of vessels began making their way across Bass Strait. Gradually, a thriving maritime industry emerged. Wharves and jetties were constructed for offloading and loading the many goods being brought in and taken out of the Port Phillip district. Dry docks were constructed for building and repairing ships. It served as Melbourne's first anchorage and as the centre for port facilities to the Port Phillip district until the late 19th century. The need for navigational aids along Victoria's windswept southern coast didn't occur until 1848 with the construction of the Cape Otway Light Station, which is the oldest surviving lighthouse on mainland Australia. The light is perched on towering sea cliffs where Bass Strait and the Southern Ocean collide. For thousands of immigrants, after many months at sea, Cape Otway was their first sight of land after leaving Europe. The first lighthouse at Point Gellibrand preceded Cape Otway by 8 years and was built of timber, and housed an oil-burning beacon. It wasn't until 1850 that a bluestone lighthouse replaced it. It operated as a lighthouse until 1860, when it was replaced initially with a lightship and later a pole light built and anchored off Shelley Beach. The old light then served as a Timeball Tower. This consisted of a large painted wooden or metal ball that is dropped at a predetermined time to enable navigators to verify their marine chronometers from their ships offshore. Accurate timekeeping is one of the means by which longitude can be determined at sea. In 1934, the Timeball Tower was extended with a 9-metre circular brick tower on top. Due to the loss of the pile light's singularity against the backdrop of light emanating from the city of Melbourne, the Timeball Tower was re-established as a lighthouse. The new light was electric, gave a green and red light and a visibility of 28 kilometres, and operated as a lighthouse from 1934 to 1987. A sad footnote to this story is that the pile light anchored off Shelley Beach was destroyed in 1976 when a vessel, the 7,000 tons Melbourne Trader, collided with it. The 70-year-old pylons didn't have the strength to hold up against the weight of the ship. The force of the collision snapped the light station off its pylons at water level, leaving it hanging precariously. The harbour master of the day was not prepared to risk people's lives to secure or repair the structure, so reluctantly ports and harbours gave the order to set fire to it at 11 a.m. on the 23rd of June 1976. Initially, the population of Williamstown was largely made up of men who worked at occupations related to the increasingly busy port. Numerous lodging houses were built, providing accommodation to a constantly changing population. Williamstown, however, remained a relatively primitive settlement until the Victorian gold rush of the 1850s. But after the gold seekers began to arrive, many from the tin mines of Cornwall and many more from the Californian goldfields, the settlement's growth was rapid. In 1851, after the separation of the Port Phillip district from the colony of New South Wales and the creation of the colony of Victoria, Williamstown was granted municipal status. Its first council was elected in April 1856. By this time, many shops, businesses and residences had begun to be established, with Williamstown playing a key role in the colony of Victoria and its connection to the world beyond. The colonists of Port Phillip, though a long way from the turbulence of Europe, still considered themselves vulnerable to foreign European interests. On the 3rd of March 1854, Australia's first telegraph line began operating between Melbourne and Williamstown, and a year later, in 1855, during the Crimean War, Fort Gellibrand was built to guard the colony against a possible Russian invasion. The fort was still in use 60 years later for training new soldiers for the Great War. Wealth created by the Victorian gold rush translated into increasingly sophisticated development of the town. Piped water from the Yan Yean water supply subsequently arrived, assisting even more rapid development. Not all in Williamstown were becoming wealthy, and with some impoverished settlers turning to crime, floating prison hulks were moored in Hobson's Bay. These included the President, Success, Deborah, and Sacramento. By the end of 1853, 455 prisoners were incarcerated. A fifth hulk, the Lysander, was added in 1854. By 1856, there were over 6,000 prisoners on these prison hulks, some as young as 9 years of age. In 1885, the prison hulks were ordered to be broken up. Success escaped this fate, and in 1890 was bought by entrepreneurs and fitted out as a floating museum. Lifelike wax figures wearing prison clothes and manacles depicted the sensationalised stories of the convicts who had filled its cells. By 1861, Williamstown had 13 slips for boat repairs and building, and pier accommodation for 40 vessels. By 1870, the town was known as the major cargo port of Victoria, with piers, slipways, shipwrights and gangs of wharfies all working along the shore opposite Nelson Place. As well, the Customs Department, pilots, the Victorian Navy and the Harbour Trust all established bases in Williamstown. In the 1950s and 1960s, the popularity of Williamstown declined, and it was viewed as a run-down, industrialised centre until its revitalisation into the tourist hub that it is today. Together with the remaining maritime industries, many early buildings along Nelson Place have survived, finding a new lease of life as cafes and gift shops. To find out more about the history of Williamstown, you can visit the Williamstown Historical Society Museum and Seaworks Williamstown, as well as contacting Parks Victoria on 13 1963.